If a stranger handed you a folded napkin that said, "Don't turn around," what would you do?
Keep eyes on the dining room. Target is in the glass box.
Two men in tailored suits were watching both exits, waiting for a multi-million-dollar deal to close. The billionaire didn't panic. He lifted his coffee cup, nodded across a crowded dining room, and played a game of survival that started with one tired waitress making a 3-second decision.
I never believed 4 handwritten words on a folded napkin could be the difference between a man walking out of a restaurant alive or not walking out at all. But on a rain-streaked Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, a tired waitress named Mara Bell looked across a crowded dining room, made a decision in less than 3 seconds, and slid a napkin across a marble bar top toward a stranger she had served exactly 1 cup of coffee. It read, "Don't turn around. They're by the exit." What happened in the 20 minutes that followed wasn't really a story about danger, even though there was plenty of that. It was a story about the strange, quiet math of courage, how it rarely announces itself, how it usually looks like someone doing one small, correct thing at exactly the right second without any idea whether it will matter. Some people wear courage like a uniform. Mara wore an apron with a coffee stain on the left pocket, and she almost didn't notice the moment her life changed because she was too busy trying to get through her shift. Stay with me, because this is one of those stories that quietly rearranges what you think bravery is supposed to look like. If stories like this mean something to you, stories about ordinary people doing something extraordinary when it counts, take a second now to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely helps more people find these stories, and I read every comment. The restaurant was called The Aldridge, a narrow, dimly lit steakhouse tucked between 2 glass office towers in the financial district, the kind of place where the wine list didn't list any prices under $60, and the bread came with 3 kinds of butter nobody asked for. Mara had worked there for 2 years. She wasn't saving for anything glamorous. Her younger brother, Eli, was 17 and had been in and out of hospitals since a diagnosis 2 years earlier that their insurance only partly covered, and Mara had learned to calculate rent, medication copays, and tip income in her head faster than most people could do long division. Her grandmother used to tell her, before she passed, that the world didn't need more people who were strong. It needed more people who were steady. Mara tried to be steady. Most nights, it was the only thing keeping her upright by the end of a double shift. She never let any of that show on the floor. She smiled at every table the same way, poured water before anyone asked, remembered names after hearing them once. It wasn't performance. It was just the only version of herself she knew how to be tired and still be decent. Julian Voss walked in a little after 7, alone in a charcoal overcoat that looked like it had never been rained on despite the weather outside. He was 39, and business magazines loved describing him in exactly the same 3 words, self-made tech billionaire, as if repeating it enough times could explain a person. What none of those articles mentioned was that Julian hadn't had a real conversation that wasn't about acquisitions, valuations, or exit strategies in longer than he could remember. He'd built a logistics software company from a garage into a firm now worth billions. And somewhere in that decade-long climb, he'd misplaced most of the people who used to just enjoy his company for free. Mara recognized him. Everyone in the city had seen his face on some magazine cover or another, but she treated him exactly like she treated the tired accountant in booth 6 and the couple on their first date by the window. Evening. Something to drink while you look at the menu? Just coffee, thank you. He said it without really looking up, and then, almost as an afterthought, he did look up, and something in her ordinary, unbothered kindness caught him off guard enough that he actually smiled. It was, Mara would realize much later, probably the first genuine smile he'd worn all week. She walked away without thinking twice about it. That was the job. You gave people small moments of decency and moved on to the next table. 10 minutes later, 2 men walked in and asked for a table near the back, close to the private dining room, where Mara would soon learn Julian was scheduled to meet with two potential investors from an overseas logistics firm about a deal that had been under negotiation for 8 months. She clocked them the way she clocked everything on a busy floor: fast, automatic, background processing. Both men wore suits that fit too perfectly, the kind tailored specifically for that night, rather than owned for years. Neither ordered a drink, neither opened a menu. They sat with their backs straight, eyes tracking the room instead of each other, and neither one said a single word to the other for almost 15 minutes. It was the silence that got under Mara's skin first, more than anything else. People on dates talked, business partners talked. Even strangers waiting alone usually did something: scrolled a phone, glanced at a menu, tapped a foot. These two men did nothing except watch the private dining room door. A cold, specific unease settled low in her stomach, the kind she didn't have a name for yet. Julian's business partners arrived shortly after. 2 men and a woman from the overseas firm, all warm handshakes and practiced smiles, the theater of a deal that both sides wanted badly enough to pretend to enjoy each other's company over dinner first. They were led into the private room, glass walls separating it from the main floor, close enough that Mara could see them, but not hear them over the ambient noise. She refilled water glasses. She delivered the appetizer plates. On her third pass near the private room, topping off coffee, she caught fragments of the conversation drifting through the cracked door. Numbers, shipping routes, the word signature repeated twice. And then, on her way back toward the kitchen, she passed close enough to the 2 silent men in the 2 perfect suits to hear one of them lean toward the other and murmur, barely above a whisper, into what she was almost certain was a small microphone clipped inside his lapel. The second he signs it, we move. Both exits covered. Mara's hand tightened so hard around the coffee pot handle that the muscles in her forearm ached for the rest of the night. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't even slow her pace, because some instinct older than conscious thought told her that whatever was about to happen depended entirely on nobody in that room knowing she'd heard anything at all. Her mind moved fast and cold, the way it sometimes did during her brother's worst hospital nights, when panic wasn't a luxury she could afford, and the only useful left to do was think clearly. She couldn't call the police from the floor. Both men were positioned with a clear line of sight to the host stand and the hallway toward the office. She couldn't walk into the private room and warn Julian directly. The glass walls meant anyone watching would see her do it in real time, and she had no idea what both exits covered meant for how fast they'd act if their plan looked compromised. She couldn't signal the manager without crossing directly through the men's sightline first. What she had was maybe 90 seconds before the meeting concluded, and Julian walked back out onto the open floor, exactly where 2 exits were apparently already covered. She thought about her brother, waiting for her at home with a movie paused on the television because he never finished anything without her. She thought about her grandmother's voice, steady, not strong, and she understood, with sudden and total clarity, that steady sometimes meant doing something quietly and immediately, without waiting for permission or certainty. When Julian stepped out of the private room a few minutes later to take what looked like a phone call, coffee cup still in hand, Mara intercepted him at the small service station near the bar, a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable spot for a waitress to check on a customer. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, voice completely level. "No, I'm all right, thank you," Julian said, already half turned back toward the private room. Mara reached for a cocktail napkin from the stack by the bar, uncapped the pen she kept behind her ear for order tickets, and in 4 seconds wrote 4 words in small, urgent handwriting: "Don't turn around." They're by the exit. She folded it once and set it down beside his coffee cup with the same unhurried motion she used for every check, every receipt, every small transaction of the evening. "Have a good night," she said, and walked away before he'd even looked down. Julian glanced at the napkin the way anyone glances at an unexpected note, mild curiosity, nothing more, right up until he unfolded it and read 4 words that rearranged the entire evening in the space of half a second. He didn't turn around. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to look, and he didn't. Because whatever was happening, some part of him understood that not reacting was the only card he had left to play. He lifted his eyes instead, scanning the room slowly, casually, the practiced motion of a man checking his phone screen glare, and found Mara's eyes across the restaurant floor, already waiting for his. Neither of them said a word. She gave him a single, small nod. He understood. Without changing his expression, without so much as a flicker of alarm crossing his face, Julian laughed at something no one had said, the kind of easy, unbothered laugh that told anyone watching absolutely nothing was wrong. He slipped his phone into his pocket, said something about needing to step outside for reception, and began walking, not toward the exit the two men were watching, but toward the narrow hallway that led past the kitchen to the restaurant's rarely used side door, the one employees used to take out the trash. Mara was already moving. She reached the small service podium near the host stand, pressed the discreet button beneath the counter that every Aldridge employee had been trained on during orientation and prayed they'd never actually need. The restaurant's silent alarm, wired directly to a private security firm, and as a secondary protocol to the nearest police precinct. 6 months earlier, during a mandatory staff meeting she'd half paid attention to while thinking about a hospital bill, Theo had walked the entire waitstaff through exactly this scenario, where the button was, what it did, how long it would take for a response. At the time, it had felt like a formality, the kind of training nobody expects to actually use, filed away somewhere she assumed she'd never need to retrieve. Tonight, her thumb found it without hesitation, muscle memory doing the work her racing mind didn't have time for. Within seconds, the restaurant's floor manager, a calm, broad-shouldered man named Theo, who had once worked hotel security, moved with startling speed toward the front entrance, quietly engaging the electronic lock without drawing a single eye from the two men still fixed on the private dining room door. The door Julian was no longer anywhere near. Outside, as it happened, a patrol unit was already 2 blocks away, responding to an unrelated call. The dispatch radio lit up seconds later. They arrived at the Aldridge in just under 4 minutes. The two men, realizing far too late that their target had vanished and that uniformed officers were now stepping through the front entrance, were taken into custody without a single shot fired, without a single raised voice, without a single other diner in that restaurant, fully understanding, in the moment, how close the room had come to something none of them would have walked away from unshaken. Julian came back through the side hallway a few minutes later, pale, hands not quite steady, and instead of leaving through the chaos of police lights now visible through the front windows, he walked directly across the dining room to the small service station where Mara was still standing, trying very hard to look like a woman who hadn't just made a decision that might have saved a life. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Not a performance. Just 4 words, flat and stunned. Mara looked down at the coffee pot still in her hands. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No." He shook his head slowly. "Most people freeze. You didn't." She didn't have a good answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. By the next morning, the story had made it onto 3 local news stations, and within another day, national outlets. A billionaire, an attempted attack tied to a soured overseas deal, a waitress who'd slipped him a warning on a cocktail napkin without alerting anyone in the room. Reporters loved the detail of the napkin most of all. Julian, in every single interview, redirected credit immediately and completely. "I didn't survive because I'm wealthy or well-connected," he told one anchor, visibly uncomfortable with the cameras. "I survived because a 24-year-old waitress noticed something the rest of us missed and had the presence of mind to act on it in about 4 seconds. That's the story. Not me." Mara hated almost every part of the attention that followed. Cameras outside her apartment building, strangers recognizing her at the grocery store. She wanted, more than anything, to go back to a version of her life where the hardest decision of her week was how to stretch a paycheck around a hospital copay, not fielding interview requests from producers who kept mispronouncing her last name. A week after the incident, Julian reached out, not through a publicist, not through an assistant, but a short, plainly worded text asking if she'd be willing to get coffee, quietly, no press, no photographers, just a conversation. She almost said no. Part of her worried that saying yes would turn into another version of the same performance. Another photo, another headline, another retelling of a night she was still, if she was honest with herself, having trouble sleeping through. But there was something in the plainness of his message, the total absence of any handler's fingerprints on it, that made her curious enough to reply. She said yes, mostly out of curiosity about what a billionaire possibly wanted to say to her that hadn't already been said in 6 different interviews. They met at a small, unremarkable diner 3 neighborhoods away from either of their usual lives. No reporters, no assistants, no glass walls, just 2 people and 2 cups of coffee that neither of them finished. Mara found herself talking more than she'd intended to. About Eli, about the diagnosis, about the particular exhaustion of loving someone whose survival came with a monthly invoice attached to it. She hadn't meant to say that much. Something about the ordinariness of the diner made it easier than it should have been. Julian listened without interrupting, without the practiced sympathetic nodding of someone waiting for their turn to talk. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before he spoke. "My father was a janitor," he said finally, "at a community college for almost 30 years. When I was 16, my family couldn't afford for me to apply anywhere, let alone attend. A man my father used to help shovel his driveway out every winter, no reason, just decency, found out about it somehow, and quietly paid my entire first year of tuition. Never told anyone. My father only found out because the registrar's office called the house by mistake." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite looking at her. "I spent the next 20 years building something enormous. And somewhere in there, I completely forgot that the entire reason I got a running start in the first place was one man's small, unglamorous decision to help someone he didn't have to help. You reminded me of that in about 4 seconds, with a napkin." Mara felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized had been sitting there, tight, for longer than just this past week. "You remembered that. Because of last Thursday," he almost laughed. "I guess I did." Neither of them turned that conversation into a headline. There was no dramatic proposal of gratitude, no oversized check handed over for cameras. What happened instead unfolded quietly, over the following months. Julian anonymously covered the remainder of Eli's outstanding medical costs. Mara only found out when the hospital billing office called to confirm a zero balance she hadn't authorized, and it took her 3 phone calls to even figure out who had done it. Because Julian hadn't attached his name to a single part of it. He also started something else entirely, a modest, deliberately unglamorous fund aimed at helping restaurant and hospitality workers cover sudden medical costs for themselves or immediate family, the exact kind of financial cliff edge Mara had been quietly living on for 2 years. He refused to name it after himself. When his communications team suggested the Voss Fund for branding purposes, he told them, flatly, to try again. They called it instead the Second Cup Fund, a small, private joke between 2 people about the coffee neither of them had finished that first strange, terrifying, world-rearranging Thursday night. When a reporter eventually tracked down the story behind the fund's name and asked Julian directly why a man of his resources hadn't simply used his own name, the way most philanthropy of that size usually did, his answer ran in print exactly as he said it, no editing, because there was nothing to improve about it. "A billionaire didn't save my life that night. A 24-year-old waitress did, with 4 words on a napkin. If I put my name on this, instead of remembering that, I'd be missing the entire point of why it exists." Mara kept working at the Aldridge for another year before eventually, at Julian's quiet insistence and her own growing curiosity, joining the Second Cup Fund full-time, helping build exactly the kind of emergency support system she once desperately needed and never had. Customers occasionally still recognized her, the waitress from the news story, and thanked her, sometimes clumsily, for what she'd done. She always gave roughly the same answer, worn smooth by repetition, but no less true for it. "I wasn't brave because I wasn't scared. I was brave because someone needed 30 seconds of clear thinking, and I happened to be the person standing there." 3 years later, the Second Cup Fund had quietly helped almost 4,000 restaurant and hospitality workers across 11 cities cover medical emergencies that would otherwise have bankrupted them, buried them in debt, or forced impossible choices between rent and treatment. Families stayed housed. Siblings like Eli kept their treatments uninterrupted. None of the recipients ever met Julian Voss in person. Most of them had never even heard his name attached to it. One folded cocktail napkin, 4 rushed words written in under 5 seconds by a tired waitress who wasn't thinking about legacy or gratitude or anything beyond the next 30 seconds of a stranger's safety, had become something neither of them could have designed on purpose if they'd tried. And maybe that's the part of this story worth sitting with longest. Kindness, the real, unglamorous, inconvenient kind, rarely announces its own significance in the moment. It usually just looks like someone doing one small, correct thing, quickly, without waiting to find out if it will matter. If this story stayed with you at all, let it be a nudge. Notice the thing that feels slightly wrong before you talk yourself out of noticing it. Say the uncomfortable, necessary sentence instead of staying quiet. Offer the 10 seconds of help that costs you almost nothing and might, for someone else, cost everything if you don't. You never really know in the moment how far 4 words on a napkin might travel. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs a reminder tonight that ordinary people are still capable of extraordinary decisions. Because the world, now more than ever, could use a few more of them.